On August 2000, Vallejo, California, seemed like a neighborhood immune to danger. Parents felt safe letting their children play, confident in the small-town comfort that the streets they knew so well were free of shadows. But how well can we truly know our surroundings? And how prepared are we to face the unexpected lurking in plain sight? These haunting questions would soon become the grim reality for the Sanchez family. Midsi Sanchez, just 8 years old, embodied joy and determination. Born on August 12, 1992, her energy was contagious, and her bravery was evident even in the smallest decisions. If you're fascinated by unraveling the darkest mysteries and exploring gripping true crime stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and become part of our investigative community. Let's dive into the case. Her 8th birthday promised celebration and joy, a milestone she eagerly anticipated throughout the day. But as the afternoon slipped into early evening, Midsi made a choice that seemed so simple: to walk home alone, leaving behind the company of her older brothers. The walk from her school to home was a mere few blocks. Midsi had traversed it countless times, her small feet tracing familiar paths on the sunlit sidewalks. The aroma of cake being prepared at home seemed to beckon her forward. However, halfway through her route, she noticed a car parked on the side of the street and a man staring intently at her from within. His gaze, cold and calculating, pierced through her initial sense of security. She chose to cross the street, instinctively distancing herself from the unsettling figure. But the man, undeterred, stepped out of the car, his voice carrying a rehearsed calm. He pointed to his side mirror, claiming an injury made it impossible to fix it alone. His limp was exaggerated, his smile practiced, and his story crafted to disarm a child's natural hesitation. Midsi, with a kind heart unguarded by experience, approached to help. Moments later, the ruse revealed its true purpose. As she leaned into the car to retrieve the tape he claimed to need, the man's facade dropped. A sudden shove and the door slammed shut, trapping Midsi in an instant. Her screams echoed within the locked vehicle as he discarded his pretense, swiftly jumping into the driver's seat and speeding away. The idyllic quiet of Vallejo shattered with her absence. What followed was a desperate race against time, a community thrust into panic, and a family left clinging to hope amidst the devastating realization that their nightmare had only just begun. The abandoned house stood silent under the moonlit sky, a haunting witness to the horrors unfolding within. Midsi, now bound and left alone, struggled against her restraints. Her tiny wrists were raw from her attempts to free herself, but the knots held firm. She sat in the suffocating darkness, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape and survival, each second stretching into eternity. The man returned hours later, his shadowy figure illuminated by the dim beam of a flashlight. Midsi instinctively recoiled as he approached, her eyes darting toward the door, hoping for an opening, a chance to run. But the stranger, calculating and cruel, seemed to anticipate her every thought. He tightened the restraints and warned her again, his voice cold and devoid of empathy. As dawn began to creep in, she noticed faint outlines of the room around her. The house was eerily desolate, filled with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. She scanned her surroundings for anything that could help her escape, but found nothing within reach. The man handed her a meager meal, just enough to keep her alive, but laced with the same bitterness she tasted before. She hesitated, but knew resistance would bring consequences. Back in Vallejo, panic had escalated into full-blown despair. The Sanchez family had alerted local authorities, who launched a search operation. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and questioning residents, but the trail was cold. Time was slipping away, and each passing hour lessened the chances of finding Midsi alive. Neighbors gathered, forming search parties to comb the streets, parks, and alleys for any sign of the missing girl. Flyers with Midsi's picture plastered telephone poles and storefronts. Her bright smile stared back at those who passed, a heart-wrenching reminder of what was at stake. Meanwhile, the man decided to move again. He loaded Midsi back into the car, blindfolding her this time to disorient her further. The vehicle hummed through desolate roads as he drove into isolation. Midsi felt every bump and turn, her mind clinging to fragments of hope. She silently vowed to fight, to find a way to outwit her captor, no matter how bleak her circumstances seemed. He had perfected his methods, carefully choosing secluded routes to avoid detection. The car's interior was suffocating, filled with the oppressive weight of the child's fear and the man's chilling indifference. Even though she was scared and tired, Midsi swore in her head that she would remember everything, including the feel of the seats, the faint smell of gasoline, and the sound of dirt crunching under the tires. The car came to a halt in an unfamiliar location, a derelict warehouse just outside city limits. The building loomed in the darkness, its broken windows and crumbling facade offering no promise of safety. The man dragged Midsi from the car, ignoring her feeble attempts to resist. Her wrists and ankles were bound tightly, the coarse rope cutting into her skin with every movement. Inside the warehouse, the air was damp and heavy with decay. Rusted machinery stood as silent witnesses to the horrors unfolding. The man placed Midsi on a stained mattress, muttering incomprehensibly to himself as he rummaged through a tattered duffel bag. He pulled out a camera, its lens glinting ominously in the dim light. For hours, he tormented his captive, taking photographs and forcing her into degrading positions. Every click of the shutter was a stab to her dwindling sense of hope. Meanwhile, law enforcement was methodically piecing together what they could about the criminal. Detectives theorized that he was intimately familiar with the city's layout, which allowed him to navigate unseen. They suspected he blended seamlessly into the community, masking his predatory nature. The discovery of the blood-soaked blanket added another layer of urgency. Though it didn't match Midsi's DNA, it hinted at the perpetrator's broader trail of violence. Each revelation brought a mix of hope and dread. Hope for a breakthrough, dread for what it might reveal. Meanwhile, the man decided to move Midsi once more. He placed a blindfold over her eyes, ensuring she could not discern where they were headed. She felt every turn and jolt of the car, her mind working frantically to remember the sequence of movements. Despite her fear, she was determined to survive, clinging to the faintest glimmer of a chance to escape. The industrial district was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in Midsi's young mind. She was slumped in the back seat, her small frame barely moving as the oppressive heat of the day lingered in the air. Every muscle in her body ached, her lips cracked from dehydration, and her spirit teetered between despair and defiance. Through the open window, she watched the man walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the derelict buildings. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Midsi was alone. Her hands, though raw and bruised, fumbled with the binds around her wrists. The rope had loosened slightly from the sweat and her constant, quiet struggles. She dared not make a sound, her ears straining to catch any sign of his return. The faint hum of distant machinery filled the air, masking the sound of her shallow breaths. With painstaking care, she wriggled her wrists free, the coarse rope falling to her lap. Her eyes darted toward the front of the car, her captor's belongings scattered haphazardly on the seat. Among them, a half-empty bottle of water gleamed in the sunlight. Her parched throat screamed for relief, but the fear of being caught paralyzed her. Midsi forced herself to focus, her mind racing through the fragments of advice she had heard from her family about survival and bravery. Her uncle's words echoed in her thoughts. Never give up, no matter how hopeless it seems. She reached for the bottle, her trembling hands making it nearly impossible to grip. She managed to take a few sips, the water burning her dry throat like fire, but it was a lifeline. Her body felt a flicker of strength, and with it came a surge of determination. Her captor's figure reappeared in the distance, a dark silhouette against the fading sunlight. Midsi climbed into the front seat, scanning for a way out. The doors were locked, but she noticed the small gap in the window. Pressing her body against the opening, she pushed herself through, the rough edges scraping her arms and legs. Just as she tumbled onto the pavement, she heard heavy footsteps approaching. The kidnapper was getting closer to the car, his arms full of bags, and froze when he saw her. "Get back here!" he bellowed, his voice filled with rage. She didn't hesitate. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the asphalt, her body screaming in protest from days of hunger and exhaustion. The man was faster, his footsteps growing louder behind her, closing the gap. Ahead, the street seemed endless, devoid of help, until headlights suddenly illuminated the road. A pickup truck was approaching, and she bolted toward it, waving her arms desperately. The truck screeched to a halt, the driver's face a mask of confusion as she scrambled onto the hood and through the passenger window. "Help me! He's going to kill me!" she cried. Without a moment's pause, the driver locked the doors and maneuvered the truck to block the road. The kidnapper, just feet away, froze, his plans unraveling before his eyes. The man turned and fled, sprinting toward his car. The driver, quick thinking, jotted down the license plate number and called the police. He handed Midsi a water bottle, and as she drank, she shakily explained everything. The abduction, the abuse, the terror of the last 2 days. Her voice was faint but determined, providing the officers with crucial details. Within hours, the authorities located the suspect's vehicle and arrested Curtis Dean Anderson, a 43-year-old man with a criminal history. In the interrogation room, Anderson's cold demeanor didn't waver. His record showed multiple prior arrests for theft and robbery, but nothing had hinted at the darkness of his current crimes. When Midsi was shown a photograph of her captor, she broke into tears, repeatedly asking if he was in custody to ensure her nightmare was truly over. News of her escape and Anderson's capture spread rapidly. Her family, overwhelmed with relief, embraced her tightly as the community that had tirelessly searched for her celebrated her return. Meanwhile, Curtis Anderson sat in a cold gray room, finally facing the justice he had evaded for so long. His reputation as a manipulative offender preceded him, and initially, he offered nothing more than a smug silence. But after hours of relentless questioning, the cracks began to show. Slowly, he confessed to Midsi's abduction, the details chilling in their precision. Detectives pressed further, asking if he was connected to other disappearances, including those of Ziana and Amber. Curtis eventually admitted to kidnapping Ziana, leading investigators to a remote site in the Santa Cruz Mountains. The discovery was gruesome. Skeletal remains confirmed to be Ziana's, showing clear signs of prolonged abuse, malnutrition, and fatal doses of substances Curtis had injected into her. The team uncovered evidence of the sadistic acts he had recorded on tape, which only deepened the horror of the case. When questioned about Amber, Curtis claimed responsibility for her disappearance, but was unable, or unwilling, to pinpoint the location of her remains. His confessions grew more erratic, with him boasting about killing 13 children. However, his vague and contradictory statements made it difficult to discern truth from fabrication. Some detectives believed he was toying with them, deliberately creating chaos to maintain a sense of control. Meanwhile, the evidence recovered from Curtis's belongings painted a damning picture. Items linked to several of his victims were found, along with disturbing journals detailing methods of manipulation and control. The scope of his crimes appeared far greater than anyone had anticipated. As Curtis remained in custody, the community struggled to process the magnitude of his confessions. Families of missing children from Vallejo and beyond contacted authorities, desperate to know if Curtis might have been involved in their cases. Investigators were overwhelmed, sifting through years of cold cases in search of links to the man who had terrorized their city. For Midsi, the ordeal was far from over. Despite being free, she grappled with the psychological scars left by her abductor. Her parents tried their best to shield her from the media frenzy that followed Curtis's arrest, but the public's curiosity was insatiable. Each day brought new revelations about the man who had stolen her innocence, and the weight of the trauma began to take its toll on the young girl. At school, whispers and cruel remarks followed her through the hallways, a constant reminder of the horrors she had endured. Children, lacking the empathy to grasp the gravity of her trauma, taunted her with comments that cut deeper than any physical wound. Some accused her of seeking attention, while others went as far as saying she deserved what had happened. Her parents did everything they could to shield her from the cruelty, but the damage was already taking its toll. Nightmares plagued her sleep, and every sound seemed to echo the voice of her captor. She began therapy to confront her trauma, but the relentless bullying only compounded her struggles. By the age of 14, she stopped attending her sessions entirely, feeling they offered no solace. Her mental health spiraled, and she sought escape through dangerous means. Alcohol became her first refuge, its numbing effects dulling the persistent memories of her captivity. By 15, Midsi had graduated to stronger substances. and her frequent absences from home became a source of deep anguish for her family. Rumors began to circulate that she had joined a gang, and though she later admitted to it, the full extent of her involvement remained unclear. Fights became routine, and some whispered that she had taken part in robberies, a far cry from the innocent child her parents once knew. In 2009, at just 16, Midsi's reckless lifestyle reached a near-fatal climax. She was riding in a car with a friend who was drunk, the vehicle careening out of control before slamming into another. Without a seatbelt, Midsi was thrown through the windshield at terrifying speed. Her body hit the pavement with a force that left her in a coma for 2 weeks. Her injuries were catastrophic, multiple fractures and internal trauma that required extensive surgery to piece her back together. When she finally regained consciousness, doctors delivered news that would change her life. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. For the first time in years, she saw a glimmer of purpose. The child growing inside her became the catalyst for a transformation Midsi had long thought impossible. Determined to create a better future for her daughter, Midsi entered detox, resumed therapy, and began taking steps to rebuild her life. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl, a living symbol of the resilience and strength that had carried her through years of torment. As she held her newborn for the first time, Midsi vowed that her daughter would never know the pain she had endured. Months later, news of another missing child reignited memories Midsi had tried to bury. The victim, an 8-year-old Latina girl, bore an uncanny resemblance to her at the time of the abduction. Unable to ignore the parallels, she threw herself into action. She printed thousands of flyers, distributed them tirelessly, and provided emotional support to the grieving family. Her involvement didn't stop there. She joined a foundation organized by the father of Polly Klaus, another young victim of abduction. Through her volunteer work, she began speaking at schools, sharing her story with the hope of educating children on how to recognize and react to danger. Her presentations were raw and heartfelt, resonating with both children and adults. Over time, her efforts evolved into her own foundation, dedicated to supporting kidnapping victims and their families. What started as a personal mission to heal became a movement to protect others. She turned her pain into purpose, ensuring that her voice would echo louder than the cruelty and trauma that once defined her life.